Good afternoon. And there's like a half a light. Good afternoon, everyone. It's July 23rd, and we are going to start the Special Business District Advisory Board meeting. We'll start with a call to order. Today we have in person Tripp Straub, Kathy Anderson, Cami Waldman, Alex Berger, and Julie Blackerby. We are missing Amr Aberdois and Jeff Yorg. Let's take a moment to consider the minutes from June 25th, 2026. Does everyone motion to approve these minutes?
Or does anyone have any amendments?
Last name. First name, how's the last name? We got the P right, so now we need to know.
I want to go on record as I am incapable.
Where? I'll stop.
I want to go on record as saying that I am unable to get Tripp's name correct. I like the email with the I like the email with the 20 Ps. Yes, we'll make that amendment, obviously.
Does anyone else have an amendment? Okay, I'd like to motion to approve.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Next on our agenda is a infrastructure and parking subcommittee update.
I can do it if you need me to, but
Sure. Well, yes. So we met, I guess now 2 weeks ago, and we came up, Gary came up with these great signs to notify all of our residents and non-residents where there will be public parking accessible in private garages. We had a couple of tweaks of just making the word public a little bit bigger. But we're hoping to get these on all the private garages. And then I know we're still in the process of working with, again, private garages to help get restaurant workers a discounted rate so that they are able to park in these garages so they're not taking up street spots, but that's still kind of in flux.
and so just two things to add about that. The parking signs that the council lady was talking about are the color was changed to green. I think the
That's right.
document she just held up was blue, and I think the subcommittee recommended green. And so since that meeting, I've gone out and done a field observation of all the locations, and turns out we have a handful of locations that don't have existing streetscape. So the plan is to put those signs on city property, which would be the light poles adjacent to the garage entrances. And we have a handful of those garages that just don't have the streetscape, which is necessary because we're also going to pull the power through those too. So those won't be able to be done, but the sites that we do have street poles for still count for about 11,500 spaces. So we've identified quite a few spaces to be with that. And so in that subsequent iteration, then eliminating those signs that we don't have poles for, I'm estimating the total cost has come down to about $89,000. So if you remember when we did the budget a couple meetings ago, we were pledging like 45 next year's budget towards that, and then whatever fund we had left over at the end of this year, which we anticipated another 45. So in theory, until we start getting real RFP responses on sign construction and stuff like that, and field inspections of the poles, we should be able to cover that with next year's allocated funds. So.
Gary, when do we intend to have the signage complete?
So I think the process that we discussed at the subcommittee meeting last time was that I was going to make a couple of those changes to the document that Kami just held up, and they would review that at their next month meeting, which I think is the 19th. That should, for all intents and purposes, finalize the subcommittee's work on that particular topic, and we would bring that to this committee and the Economic Development Committee the next week, since they both meet on the same day, and get the broader group's input and make any refinements based on there. Then that would be a recommendation. Assuming that there are recommendations, we would go into September and finalize a recommendation to the city council. And then we put that in that process there.
Okay.
But obviously we have to wait till the next fiscal year budget kicks in, but we'll have to do, part of the process will be Public Works will engage a professional to examine some of the poles, because we had some unforeseen issues with those in the past, to make sure those will be supportive. We'll have to issue an RFP for the construction of the signs. So, hopefully, if all goes well, we could have signs up, late next summer.
Great.
And then following up on that restaurant employee parking, I want to thank the mayor, because I have heard recently from Centene, who has expressed interest in potentially participating with that. So I have turned that over to Mike Shadle, who is the chair of the Economic Development because he represents a major garage in downtown. He was going to speak owner to owner to a lot of these people to further that discussion, because I was having it with property managers, and there's a lot of layers to get to make a decision like that. So Mike thought it would be a little bit more expedient for him to take that on. The final thing that I had put on here is, this was another topic that was discussed at the parking subcommittee, is one of the topics that continues to come up, especially from some of our restaurants like you, obviously, Julie and Amer, is the parking situation for customers. And so the current program, and we're getting ready to email this out to all the restaurants and retailers, but Passport allows merchants to buy blocks of time and then give them out to their customers for validation purposes. The subcommittee has also discussed perhaps subsidizing that for retailers in some way. So I'm still having conversations with Passport, because transactions still cost the city, regardless of whether who's paying for it or not. So, but I think the way it's kind of looking at is that, potentially we could offer discounted programs as long as the cost of the transaction is covered. I mean, obviously that's setting aside the opportunity cost of the city not receiving the parking revenue from the actual transaction. But the subcommittee will have more discussion on that next month. But we are notifying all the retailers now that there is an option for them to do that. It is through the Passport app, so.
Would it be possible for us to have, similarly to how we're doing with Pace, or how we did with Pacer AI, but to have a meeting with Passport? I would just be curious from my standpoint on, I just would have certain questions about this. And then, and we can talk about it in the subcommittee, but also just how the discount and validation would affect the tax or the revenue coming in to the city, to see if it would be, I guess my thing is, like, if I make this validation code and I give it to Kathy tomorrow, what would stop Kathy from using it again the next day?
It's a one and done.
Okay, it would.
Yeah, it's all digital system. It's not, there's no juking it.
Okay,
Yeah, it's a specific code. So the way the system is set up now is Ivy could buy a block of time, and you would give a code to Kathy, and it'd be a specific code for a certain amount. And, if it's 2 hours, it'd be $3. And then she would enter that, and that's gone. There is no recapture of that. So she couldn't
Use it again.
Yeah, and that's part of the thought process in this too, is that, you don't want to do it completely free, because I think that's gonna, unfortunately, it sounds ridiculous, but I do spend a good amount of my time on parking hustles on all kinds of things. There's a black market for residential passes. It's just crazy stuff. So you have to, my thought process is, as I'm developing this proposal for the subcommittee, is that, there has to be some kind of barrier. So not that you would ever do this, but, buy a block of time and then give it to all your employees to park on the street while their shift is going on.
Right.
So we are trying to address that, but you can't reuse a code.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be interested to talk about this at the next subcommittee. Okay, anyone have questions regarding the passport?
Question though about parking.
Mhm.
So are parking tags the ones that hang on your winch, are those, you don't use those anymore? Somebody told me those weren't valid anymore.
No, all the residential passes were switched to digital a couple years ago.
Yes, I didn't read that.
Yes. Maybe it's in those deleted emails. You can still go to the police station and pick up hang tags for your visitors, but they are now dated. But you can also do visitors on the digital format too.
Okay, so if like a cleaning woman is coming every.
I would put her on, if she is a regular employee of the household, or however you want to term that, I would put her on your family plan.
Okay,
Visitors are kind of Sally's coming in from Chesterfield for
okay,
a card game or something like that.
okay.
So if we're ready to move on. I put the fiscal year 2028 planning on there as a topic just because it's come up the last couple of times we've had budget discussions. I know Mr. York brought it up. I think Trips brought it up, and some others have brought it up about what exactly the special district is funding and why is it funding that. I think this time through the budgeting process, we were all kind of new and really just kind of took the process as we've done it in the past. But I know there was some expression that we wanted to stop and think about how we were funding and what we were funding with the special business district money. So I think that may be a topic for future discussions if this group decides to do that. As we discussed in the past, whatever we shift out of this funding, we shift onto the general fund. So that, ultimately be a consideration for the city council.
I think it would be worth diving a little deeper into exactly where the tax dollars come from for the fund as well. Like, is it primarily funded through sales tax, or is it general Clayton tax, this percentage of it?
It's a property tax.
Okay,
So you're paying for it, Trip's paying for it, everybody who owns or probably potentially leases. I don't know anyone that doesn't pass that on through a lease. So you're paying for it. So we can talk about the history of the revenue and the source of the revenue if you'd like to at next time, and then kind of we've already done with the budget process, but we can talk about where we've spent it in the past, and then we can talk about state legislation about what is an eligible expense, because there are restrictions to it, but for the most part, it's pretty broad. But I think there was discussions about why are we paying for all the staff out of this fund, or why are we paying for this, and why are we paying for that, Not trying to put words in anyone's mouth, but that the topic was brought up a couple of times.
sure. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to revisit that and also understand exactly where it's coming from so that we could see if there's any potential to raise it naturally as well. Or strategically, rather.
Yes, raising taxes is always well received for the most. Trip, are you squirming? But yeah, no, I understand your point. I think that a lot of municipalities are looking at those kind of issues, not only with like these kind of taxes, but with the regular property tax too. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of municipalities, this isn't really applicable to the special business district, but Missouri law really caps the growth of municipality revenue. So much so that, healthcare or personnel expenses really blow past any growth rate for the municipal revenue. And, the only time that we would make additional revenue is like, if we build a new Emerson building again, or, locate a Costco or something like that with the sales tax generation.
I got a quick comment, my thoughts, I think, related to this. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but let's, ballpark, we bring in $500,000, $500,000. But really, this group of 8 people here, 1 or 2 online, whatever, we're really talking about spending about $150,000. Once you take out all of the salaries and kind of what I would call fixed expenses. And again, these are very rough numbers, but I think the point, and I'm glad you put it on here because I think it will benefit us. If you add up the accumulated, hour times, and I see we're going to talk about regular meeting date and time, but the amount of time / dollars that are spent on spending $150,000, that's way overkill in my opinion. Again, I don't know the details, but that's why I think it's worth a conversation. Why are we spending all this time? It's $150,000, which it's a lot of money, but does it take this much brain power to figure that out? My answer would be no, using those rough numbers, but getting into the details, hopefully that would become more clear.
No, I agree with you, Trip. And I think we had initial conversations when this group started that, potentially the workload would be heavier at the beginning, and then potentially we could move to bi-monthly, or meaning every other month, or quarterly for this group, because they're, outside of the special business district budget. That's kind of the realm of this committee. But, I don't want to speak for Councilman York, but, I think he's the one that brought up, should the council consider shifting that other $350,000 to the general fund and letting this group make recommendations? Because at the end of the day, that's all we're doing here is making a recommendation to the city council, because we can recommend whatever and they can do exactly what they want. So I think it's twofold. And then in addition, we do have this parking subcommittee going too. So I think there is additional work other than just deciding the 150,000.
I think too, it'll be interesting to think about, I think again, for this group to think about creative. I feel like we talked a lot about parking when we first started, and I think we've made some great inroads. But I know everybody, talked about lights and just ways to make downtown more vibrant and inviting. So I think, again, thinking about some sort of, and maybe that's like one sort of creative project a year. I mean, maybe this year it's, well, I guess next year, because the parking's going to fall into the next fiscal year, but still thinking about, potentially some sort of, whether it's a cool, I'm just making this up, but like a sculpture or some sort of cool light, or you take one of our alleys and create a really cool mural that people might want to come and see. I mean, so something that again is like, and then we invite social media influencers to come in and be like, like Nashville has those wings that everybody takes pictures in front of, it's thinking about something that doesn't necessarily cost $150,000, but thinking about how could we be creative to put something cool in the middle of downtown that people want to see. So when they're walking around, they're like, oh, we saw that cool mural that somebody put on social media, or that light that like some goofy light that follows you around. Let's go up to the corner and see that. I'm just suggesting, again, thinking about ways that you guys talked about trying to make downtown which is where the special business district funds go to, you know, more vibrant, more just kind of like a destination place. So,
So if you're okay with Julie, I think I'll put together a presentation for next meeting, talking about the budget, why it is, how it is, and what can be used for it. So maybe it'll spur a little bit more conversation.
That would be great. Okay. Next on our agenda is our meeting schedule, and I know that Gary has just mentioned this, but how are we feeling about the cadence of our meetings?
Yeah, I mean, my intent of putting this on there was to address the cadence and then to address the date and time. That is come up with some, more so in the other committee, I think, but just confirming that, this is the date and time, setting aside the frequency at this point of this meeting. And then I do think that it helps to have a regular date and time, whether the schedule is every 2 months, 1 month, or once a quarter, but the regular schedule helps in the logistics behind the scenes. And then just something I wanted to bring up in anticipation of later this year is that the November and December meeting dates for us will fall on days that the city hall is closed. So I won't be here.
Well, I like this date and time. And I'm fine with us continuing on a monthly basis for now, but I do agree that we could probably go bi-monthly rather soon. And in terms of the holiday schedule, perhaps we could just have one meeting at any point during those 2 months.
Just reschedule it in
Correct.
between, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, just because it's on the calendar doesn't mean that it can't be canceled.
right.
Yes.
If we
Mhm.
plan ahead, perhaps. prepare with it.
Yeah.
A lot of committees take, especially December, off.
I'm super good with that. Okay, sounds good.
Is there anything pressing that we wouldn't want to start meeting every?
No, not that I'm aware of, Gary.
Mhm.
Well, I think for the immediate future, until we get the parking sign issue behind us,
Okay.
we probably need a meeting at least next month, and then we can keep September on the schedule, but see where it really depended on the comments. So, we're running this parallel with another committee too. So we will bring everybody that's on that subcommittee will bring the plan, I anticipate, next month to both groups, and we'll see what comments we get. And then if there's not any comments, then, we can move to the recommendation to the city council and move on from there and start a bi-monthly program. But, maybe it's perhaps at least until we get into a regular flow, keep it on a monthly schedule, and then we can always cancel the meeting should we not have anything to necessarily talk about, because there's no sense in.
I agree with what Gary just rolled out to the committee. I think it's really important that we continue meeting regularly until we get to a point where maybe we don't need that same commitment. But right now, I think we need that commitment.
I like that. So we can continue with our regularly scheduled meeting through next month, see where we get with our budget discussion as well as our parking discussion, and then from there, potentially move to go every other month. With the goal of skipping November and December.
But this will be the committee's first time with the art fair and with the holidays and all, so. That may or may not affect it. But probably.
No, I mean, I think once we get through the budget discussion and the parking signs, I think the meeting schedule will be kind of self-evident at that point in time. You know, if we're still talking about $150,000, then that's probably a quarterly, bi-monthly type meeting. If we're talking about 550, when we want to reevaluate all the programs under that, because the categories of what the state allows us to spend that money on are very broad. Events, public infrastructure, marketing. I mean, you name it, it's almost in there. So we can do everything from flyers to trolleys. Not that I'm suggesting we do trolleys.
No trolleys.
No trolleys.
Ever.
Okay. Yeah, I do like the idea of revisiting the vibrancy stuff,
Mhm.
because I do think we have moved away from it to some degree while we focused on the parking, so. Okay, sounds good. Does anyone have further comment? Okay, I'm going to make a motion to adjourn.
Record time. Well done, Julie.
Well, Cammie's got things to do, so Cammie, everybody knows your schedule. What are you shaking your head about, man?